Hi, everybody. Tonight I invite you to drift with me far back through the sands of time to a land where golden suns scorched the earth and the great river Nile carved life into a barren desert. We shall wander together through the hidden chambers of ancient Egypt, not to gaze only upon its glittering pyramids and mighty pharaohs, but to peer quietly into the harsher shadows that lay behind its stone facades. This is a story of ordinary lives under an unforgiving sun, of toil and hunger, of fleeting moments of beauty amid the weight of relentless labor. So settle beneath your blankets, close your eyes if you wish, and let the hush of history cradle you towards sleep, as we begin to understand why life was often so brutal in ancient Egypt. Long ago, before the word Egypt was ever spoken by foreign tongues, a people settled along the winding spine of the Nile. Here, the river gave them what no desert could, a thin green ribbon of soil rich enough to coax barley and emmer wheat from the sand. Each year, when the river swelled and spilled over its banks, it left behind new earth, black and moist and ready for the wooden plow. The people worshiped this rhythm like a god, for without it, there would be no life at all. Yet with this gift came a price. The flood could bless, but it could also drown. In years when the Nile rose too high, it swept away homes, toppled granaries, and ruined the same fields that fed the people. In years when the waters came too low, famine crouched at every door. There were no distant markets to bring food from afar, no caravans braving the desert with grain enough for all. A bad flood meant empty bellies, and empty bellies meant bodies laid upon the cool earth far too soon. Even so, the people endured. They built villages of mud brick near the river's edge, each home no more than a few rooms. The walls cracked with heat, but shaded enough to keep the midday sun at bay. Inside, families huddled around small hearths, sharing flat loaves baked on hot stones, bowls of lentils or beans if they were lucky. Meat was rare for the common folk, perhaps a bit of fish from the river, or a chicken kept for festivals, its feathers ruffled and its squawk familiar to children who chased it through the dusty courtyards. As we drift among these ancient homes, we see children stirring before dawn, called by the low voice of a mother or father who rose even earlier. A boy might help grind grain between two stones, his small hands turning them round and round until they blistered. A girl might carry jars to the riverbank, balancing them on her head as she stepped carefully past reeds that rustled with unseen creatures. They learned young that to live meant to work, and to work meant to survive the mercurial mercy of the Nile. Outside the villages, fields stretched in neat strips, some thick with barley swaying in the breeze, others dotted with squat fig trees or date palms. Men bent at the waist for hours under the punishing sun, hacking at weeds, guiding water from irrigation ditches with simple wooden tools, singing low chants to keep the rhythm steady. Women joined them when needed, their backs just as bowed, their skin just as scorched. When the harvest came, it was gathered by hand, bundled on the backs of donkeys, or dragged on sledges across the sand to the granaries that rose like squat fortresses against the endless sky. But these harvests were not truly theirs. Taxes came in sheaves of wheat and jars of beer, demanded by scribes who traveled from village to village, their reed pens tucked behind their ears, their tablets ready to record every owed bushel. The people knew well that the pharaoh was not only ruler, but living God, and his temples must be fed. The priests must be fed. The soldiers who guarded the borders, the nobles who held court by lotus-filled pools, each one needed grain from the hands of farmers who sometimes went to bed hungry themselves. In their tiny courtyards, families whispered prayers to Osiris and Isis, to the gods of grain and harvest, of life and death. They begged for mercy in years when the sky held no rain, and the Nile trickled low and muddy. They wept in secret when cattle sickened and fields withered beneath the merciless sun. And still they rose each morning, stepped into the fields, and bent their backs anew. Yet not all was hardship alone. On certain evenings when the work was done and the sky burned red over the horizon, there came moments of fleeting rest. Neighbors gathered to share gossip and laughter. A young boy carved little toys from scraps of wood. A girl wove garlands of papyrus reeds to lay upon her mother's brow. They found joy in simple things, the smell of bread baking, the splash of cool river water against bare feet, the gentle hum of insects in the reeds at dusk. It is this quiet duality that lies at the heart of our story. For while the temples rose in splendor, and pharaohs slept in tombs of unimaginable wealth, the people who built these wonders lived lives of ceaseless struggle. Their hands shaped history, but history rarely spoke their names. Tonight we shall walk beside them through dusty streets and sweltering fields, through hunger and hope, through birth and burial. And as we listen to their forgotten voices, perhaps we may glimpse for a moment what it truly meant to be alive and to suffer in ancient Egypt. So lie still, breathe slow, and let the river carry you onward, for this is but the first step along a long and winding journey through the sands and sorrows of a civilization both timeless and terribly mortal. In the hush of dawn, when the faintest blush of sun crept over the eastern horizon, the farmers of the Nile rose before the ibis stirred from its roost. They woke to the chorus of frogs and the soft lap of river water against their reed boats, and they stepped out into the cold sand that would soon be scorching under a ruthless sun. In this second step of our journey, let us drift among them, feel the rough linen against their skin, smell the damp scent of earth as they tilt their heads toward the sky in silent hope for another day's mercy. A father would gather his simple tools, a wooden hoe, its edge worn smooth from seasons of toil, a woven basket for carrying reeds or grain, a jar of beer, sour and thick, to quench his thirst when the sun reached its cruelest height. He would glance at his son, barely 12, standing barefoot beside him, clutching a smaller hoe in hands still soft with youth. There was no question of schooling for most. If the boy was lucky, perhaps a local scribe would teach him to read a few symbols, enough to tally what little they owned. But letters were a luxury for those whose days were measured in sweat. They walked together through narrow paths lined with thorny bushes, past the sluggish canals dug by ancestors whose bones now fed the same soil. Here and there, the rising sun caught the backs of white egrets picking delicately among the reeds, their reflections shimmering like ghosts upon the water's skin. The father glanced at these birds and muttered a quiet blessing, for the Nile's creatures were part of the delicate balance that kept life teetering just above starvation. In the fields, neighbors were already at work. Their voices rose in low chants, each line answered by the next, a rhythm older than the pyramids themselves. They sang of the river's bounty, of the strength of the bull, of the mercy of Hapi, god of the inundation. Bent double, they drew water from simple shaduffs, long poles balanced on pivots, weighted at one end with stones, at the other with clay jars. Up and down, they lifted the Nile's blessing from one canal to the next, drenching furrows that would soon bristle with green. But the water was never enough for everyone. Farther from the river, the land turned stubborn and dry, and families argued over every trickling channel. A broken dike could doom a season's yield. A stolen length of water in the night could spark blood feuds that lingered for generations. The father warned his son in a low voice never to wander near the land that belonged to the overseer's men. Those fields were guarded by hired watchmen, men who carried sticks and flails, quick to strike at any boy who seemed too curious about where the richest water flowed. Midday came, and with it, a heat that clung to the skin and soaked linen tunics with sweat. The men stooped under simple woven hats, if they owned one, but many worked bareheaded, their shoulders blistering beneath the sun's unblinking gaze. When they rested, they sat on rough mats in the shade of scant trees, gnawing at flatbread, sipping their warm beer, sometimes sharing a bit of onion or a handful of dates if they were fortunate that season. They spoke in murmurs, of taxes due, of the scribe's next visit, of rumors of new building works upriver that would require more hands, more backs to bend, more lives spent stacking stone upon stone for the pharaoh's eternal house. Among these whispered worries, there drifted other stories too, fragments of gossip that passed like drifting reeds on the current. There was talk of a neighbor's daughter taken to serve in the great house of a local noble, her beauty noticed at the market one day as she sold baskets of onions. Some said it was good fortune. She would eat better there, wear finer linen, perhaps send back gifts of oil or honey. Others shook their heads, knowing well that to serve in another's house was to surrender freedom, to become part of another's wealth, another's ambition. When the sun began its slow descent and shadows lengthened across the rippling fields, the farmers gathered what they could carry. baskets of reeds for patching roofs, bundles of sedge to weave into mats, armfuls of wild herbs to season the evening stew. Father and son trudged home, feet dragging through dry dust that clung to their ankles. They spoke little. Words were wasted when hunger gnawed and sleep beckoned with its promise of a few short hours of peace. At the village edge, women waited with clay jars balanced on hips, their laughter drifting like faint music on the breeze. They, too, had spent the day in toil, pounding grain, weaving cloth, tending small children who toddled barefoot through courtyards, their bellies rounded from scarce meals. One woman called out a jest, and the father managed a weary smile in return. There was no room here for pride or pretense. They all shared the same lean life, the same brittle hope that tomorrow's flood might be kind. Inside their humble home, built of sun-baked mud and patched with reeds, the family gathered on mats beside a flickering oil lamp. The mother ladled a thin soup of lentils into rough clay bowls, sprinkled with herbs gathered at dawn. They ate in silence, the father's eyes heavy, the boy's eyelids drooping even as he chewed. The river's hush slipped through the narrow doorway, a lullaby older than any story spoken by human tongue. Before sleep, the father knelt by a tiny shrine, a clay figure of Osiris cradled in a niche carved into the wall. He murmured a prayer for another day of water, for enough grain to appease the taxman, for the health of his boy, who would wake again before dawn to follow his father's steps into the fields. Outside, the Nile whispered on. Somewhere in the darkness, a crocodile slid silently between reeds, its scales brushing against the moon's reflection. Stars wheeled overhead as they had for thousands of years, indifferent to the sweat and tears shed beneath their cold light. So the night returned to this quiet corner of Egypt, binding families in dreams of a gentler life, dreams that would scatter like chaff at sunrise when once more the people of the Nile rose to meet the brutal promise of another day. When dawn's first hush broke once more across the Nile's patient waters, the world of the living stirred from uneasy sleep. Beneath mud-brick roofs, the low murmur of voices and the shuffle of bare feet upon packed earth marked the beginning of another day measured in toil and small mercies. In this new chapter of our journey, we drift deeper into the lives of those who rose and bent and sweated under the watchful eyes of gods and men alike. Beyond the fields where barley and emmer wheat bent their fragile heads toward the river's blessing, another class of laborers toiled. Men whose days were spent not coaxing life from the soil, but carving the realm of the dead from the stubborn bones of the earth itself. These were the quarrymen, the stonecutters, the builders whose hands lifted dreams from bedrock and pressed them skyward, one heavy block at a time. Imagine a young man named Kem, his shoulders already roped with lean muscle despite the tender age of 17. His father had spent his life shaping limestone into temple walls and burial chambers for nobles whose names would linger in painted hieroglyphs long after the flesh of both patron and mason had turned to dust. Now Kem rose before dawn, drinking a mouthful of thick beer and tearing at stale bread, his mind already heavy with the weight of the stone he would face when the sun rose high. He joined his fellows at the edge of the village, where carts waited like patient beasts, their wooden wheels ready to grind over sand and rock. The overseer counted heads, his reed pen tapping against a roll of papyrus that listed each man and the measure of stone he was expected to yield. No one spoke of rest or respite. There was none to give. The pharaoh's tomb would not build itself, and each day's delay meant longer hours, harsher words, heavier flails for the unlucky. Their journey took them westward, away from the whispering reeds of the Nile, to where the land rose in stubborn cliffs and sun-baked quarries. There, men swarmed like ants across the pale face of stone, their picks and chisels ringing out in a chorus that echoed down dusty ravines. Kem found his place beside his father's old companions, men who barely looked up as he lifted his tool and began to strike. Each blow reverberated through his bones, an intimate conversation between muscle and rock. Chips flew, sweat poured, dust clung to every crevice of his skin until his hair turned gray with it. They worked in teams. Some cut deep grooves into the living cliff, others wedged wooden pegs into these scars and soaked them with water, watching as the swelling wood forced the rock to crack with a sound like distant thunder. Sometimes in the heat of the day, Kim paused and pressed his hand against the warm face of the stone. He wondered what secrets it held, how many lives it had seen, how many it would entomb when at last it found its place inside the pharaoh's eternal house. For to these men, the stone was not merely earth, but a bridge to immortality. Not theirs, of course, but for the rulers who promised life everlasting in the afterworld. Around noon, they rested in the thin shadows cast by half-carved walls of limestone. They drank water gone warm in clay jars, chewed on onions, and shared gossip of the overseer's temper or the rumored wealth of the next royal tomb. Some spoke of home, a wife heavy with child, a daughter promised to a neighbor's son, a field that would need tending when this season of building was done. But rest was fleeting. Soon the foreman's shout stirred them back to their feet, and the hammers rang once more. The sun arced higher, a cruel overseer of its own, draining the strength from their arms until they swung tools more from habit than hope. Blisters split and bled, wrapped hastily with strips of linen that turned red beneath the dust. When the quarrymen did return home, they did so in silence. Even the creaking of the cartwheels seemed a mercy compared to the din of hammer on stone. Kim rode with his head bowed, eyes fixed on the scarred palms resting in his lap. Around him, his fellows leaned against one another, half asleep, their bodies swaying with the cart's gentle pitch. The village came into view as dusk laid a cloak of indigo across the desert's edge. At the threshold of his family's dwelling, Kim's mother waited, her hands busy shaping dough for the small flat loaves they would share. She greeted him not with words, but with a careful touch on his shoulder, a wordless understanding of the toll paid each day in the quarries. He washed in a basin of water drawn from the river, scrubbing at the stone dust that seemed to cling even to the creases of his dreams. Inside, the small flame of an oil lamp flickered against the rough walls, casting wavering shadows that danced like the spirits of ancestors long gone. Kem ate in silence beside his mother and sister, his mind drifting not to tomorrow's labor, but to the impossible promise that somewhere within these carved stones lay eternity, a promise that belonged to the great, while he and his kin would slip from memory like dust on the desert wind. As night deepened, he lay upon a woven mat, staring at the stars that peered through the small opening in the roof. He listened to the quiet sigh of the Nile beyond the village, felt the ache in his arms and the dull throb of blisters that would split anew with each new dawn. His eyelids fell heavy, and in the hush before sleep, he dreamed not of gold or tombs, but of cool river water and a day when his hands might rest, if only for a little while. So the builders slept, stone dust still clinging to their skin, their breath mingling with the hush of reeds and the soft chorus of night insects. And the brutal work of carving immortality from mortal flesh would begin anew with the sun's next rising, as it always had and always would. As the relentless sun rose once more over the land where stone and river made a fragile truce, another quiet chapter unfolded among those who served not in the fields or the quarries, but in the bustling veins of Egypt's lifeblood, its river and its markets. For while the farmers coaxed grain from the soil and the masons coaxed temples from cliffs, traders and boatmen moved the pulse of the kingdom from village to city, from granary to temple, from the humble hearth to the steps of the palace. Along the banks of the Nile, slender boats bobbed in the early morning mist. Their hulls were simple yet strong, crafted from papyrus reeds or wooden planks lashed with rope, their sails stitched from linen bleached beneath the sun. On these boats, entire families might live for weeks at a time, ferrying goods up and down the broad, patient river that carried not just water, but wealth and rumor alike. One such family belonged to a man named Sabu. His face was seamed with fine lines from squinting into the river's glare, and his hands were rough as old rope, strong from pulling oars through the Nile's shifting moods. With him was his wife, Henut, her hair bound in a neat plait, eyes ever watchful for shifting currents and hidden sandbars that could ruin their fragile craft. And their son, little Hori, barely 10, quick and nimble, barefoot on the planks, his laughter sometimes cutting through the quiet splash of the oars. Their cargo this season was grain, a modest bounty of barley from upriver farms, packed into woven baskets and sealed with mud and reeds to keep the hungry river from stealing it away. Sabu's contract with the local granary master was clear: deliver every last grain to the city's market, or find himself stripped of pay, his debt to the overseer growing like reeds in flood season. As the sun lifted higher, the boat drifted downstream, its linen sail catching a playful breeze. Hanut crouched beside the baskets, checking for leaks or signs of damp rot, while Sabu kept his eyes on the far banks where crocodiles basked among flowering lotus blooms, their stillness deceptive as they waited for careless prey. Little Hori sat near the bow, dangling his feet over the side, trailing them in the Nile's cool current as he sang a song half remembered from his grandmother's tales. Life upon the river was never dull, but it was never gentle either. Storms could rise with little warning, whipping the placid water into waves that could dash a small craft against hidden rocks. Sandbanks shifted with the seasons, invisible traps that could ground a boat for days while its crew labored knee-deep in mud to pry it free. And there were men, too, river pirates who prowled the lonely stretches, waiting for a careless boatman to drift too far from the main channels. Sabu slept lightly, a stout oar and a knife within reach, though most nights he simply whispered a quiet plea to Sobek, the crocodile god, to guard the river paths and keep his family safe. When they reached the city's edge, the sight was a wonder to little Hori's eyes. The river widened here, choked with boats of every kind, barges laden with quarried stone, shallow craft heavy with pottery, grander vessels bearing scribes or priests beneath linen canopies. The air smelled of sweat and fish, wet wood, and baking bread. On the riverbanks, markets sprawled in a confusion of reed stalls and shouting traders, baskets of onions and garlic piled high beside coils of rope, linen cloth, and clay jars brimming with beer. Sabu's boat nudged against a worn stone quay. Other boatmen shouted greetings and insults in equal measure as they jockeyed for space to unload their cargoes. Hanut leapt lightly ashore, securing the rope, while Sabu lifted Hori onto the quay beside her. Then began the weary work of hauling each heavy basket of grain from the boat's belly, hoisting them to waiting scribes who counted every measure with a suspicious eye. They were paid in copper and barter, a handful of coins here, a small sack of lentils or salt there. Always the scribes took their share, marking down debts and fees in neat lines of hieroglyphs that Sabu could not read, but knew better than to question. When at last the baskets were empty and the boat bobbed light upon the current, Hanut spent a few copper pieces on fresh onions, a twist of dried fish, and a small sweet cake for Hori, who devoured it with sticky fingers and wide eyes that drank in the city's noisy wonders. Yet for all its crowded vibrance, the city was no place to linger. The boat was both shelter and burden, too precious to leave untended, too necessary to risk. By dusk, they pushed back into the river's gentle flow, their hull low in the water once more, this time with clay jars of beer to deliver upriver to a village festival that would soon drain its local brew dry. Under the rising stars, the family ate their meal aboard, rocking gently with the current. Hori fell asleep first, curled beside a basket that smelled faintly of malt. Hanut hummed a soft song to the river, her voice nearly lost among the sounds of water against wood, insects cheering in the reeds, and distant drums drifting from the city's heart. Sabu sat at the stern, oar resting across his knees, eyes half closed as he listened to the hush of the Nile, cradling his little world. So passed another day for those whose lives depended on the river's moods, endlessly moving, endlessly carrying the burdens of kings and farmers alike. And in the hush before dawn, as the boat drifted like a cradle between reeds and stars, the family slept in the river's arms, dreaming of safe waters and kinder winds to come. In the soft hush of a new dawn, when the first light brushed the Nile's endless waters with pale gold, there stirred within the grand cities another class of life, those who dwelt in the shadows of temples and palaces, whose days were woven from the threads of servitude and silent endurance. For while farmers bent to the soil and boatmen drifted upon the river's skin, within mud-brick alleys and behind high courtyard walls, servants and slaves bore their own share of life's unyielding burden. Imagine, if you will, a young woman named Tia. She had not chosen this life. Few ever did. Born in a village far to the south, she was the daughter of a potter whose small kiln cracked and crumbled in a year when the Nile's flood failed. Debts mounted like sand against the wind, and when the scribes came to collect what her father could not give, Tia was led away with other children, their small hands pledged to serve in the houses of those who wanted for nothing. Years passed like silent reeds drifting on the current. Tia grew from a frightened child to a quiet, watchful young woman within the sprawling household of a minor noble. The estate was neither palace nor hovel. Its walls rose whitewashed against the heat, its courtyards shaded by palms and fig trees, its floors swept daily by feet that were never allowed to rest. Here, Tia rose before dawn, slipping from her small straw mat as the sky turned lavender behind the distant temple pylons. She joined the other servants in the courtyard, washing her hands in a cool basin, braiding her dark hair tight against her scalp so no loose strands would betray sloppiness to the steward's keen eye. Her tasks shifted with the seasons. Sometimes she ground grain in the storehouse, her shoulders burning from turning the heavy quernstone hour after hour. Other days, she carried water from the well, balancing jars on her head until her neck ached and her bare feet blistered on the sun-baked path. Yet perhaps the hardest labor of all was within the noble's private rooms. Tia learned to move silently across smooth stone floors, her eyes lowered, her hands ever ready to smooth linen sheets, fan the air with woven palm leaves, or kneel at her mistress's feet to massage tired legs scented with lotus oil. She heard secrets she could never speak, fragments of argument and laughter, plans for feasts and marriages, the soft sighs of lovers in the hours when candles guttered low. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when her mistress dozed beneath a painted ceiling, Tia let her eyes drift over the painted scenes. Blue lotus blooms floating on calm waters, slender geese stepping among reeds, gods with falcon heads and jeweled collars watching forever from walls that could not age. She wondered if they watched her too, these silent deities, if they pitied the bent backs and raw hands of those who scrubbed floors so that the painted gods might remain bright. Among the servants there was camaraderie, though it bloomed in shadows and hushed corners. In the cramped servants' quarters, they shared scraps of leftover bread and figs, stolen moments of laughter that eased the sting of the steward's sharp tongue or the mistress's casual cruelty. An older girl named Dedi often sat beside Tia at night, braiding her hair by lamplight, whispering gossip from the market, who had been caught stealing, whose child was sick, whose lover had slipped away into the night and not returned. At times, when her work allowed, Tia would slip into the garden. There, hidden among tall papyrus and cool shadows, she could kneel by the small pond and watch the dragonflies skimming the water's surface. She would press her fingers to the damp earth, feeling for a moment that it belonged to her alone, this quiet, secret patch of life where no overseer's voice could follow. But the dream always ended. A call, a clap of hands, a shout from the courtyard would summon her back to her tasks. She would rise, brush the dust from her knees, and return to the world where her name was spoken only to command, where her hands were praised only when they were invisible, her voice valued only when it was silent. Yet within her chest, Tia carried a quiet ember of defiance, though she might never name it as such. At night, when she lay curled on her straw mat among the other girls, she let her mind drift to her old village, the sound of her father's kiln cracking in the heat, the taste of dates plucked fresh from a tree before debt and drought swallowed it all. She dreamed of walking again along that riverbank, of sinking her hands into soft clay, of shaping something of her own that no steward could sell, no mistress could own. Outside, the city whispered and sighed, temple drums echoing in the distance, a dog barking at shadows, the hush of wind over the Nile's silver ribbon. Somewhere beyond the courtyard walls, nobles drank wine from painted jars and spoke of taxes, of offerings to Osiris, of tombs yet to be built. And within those same walls, Tia dreamed her small, forbidden dream, her breath rising and falling like the hush of reeds in the night. When dawn came, she would rise again. She would smooth her hair, bend her back, bow her head, and quietly carry within her that fragile hope that somewhere beyond these painted walls the gods saw her too. And perhaps, in some hidden way, they wept for her as they did for kings. As the sun slipped its first pale rays over the flat roofs and temple pylons, another day stirred awake among the towering columns and incense-scented halls of Egypt's sacred places. For behind the grandeur of carved stone and the solemn faces of painted gods, there labored a quiet army whose hands kept the divine machine turning. Priests, scribes, guards, and humble workers whose lives were bound to rituals older than the pyramids themselves. Among them moved a man named Nebamun, a low-ranking temple scribe whose days unfolded in the hush of painted chambers where the air forever smelled of oil and burning myrrh. By birth, Nebamun had been luckier than most. His father, a scribe before him, had taught him the careful art of shaping words into power, lines of ink upon smooth papyrus, sacred records that gave order to a world that might otherwise crumble into chaos. Each dawn, Nebamun rose from his modest chamber near the temple's outer wall. He washed his hands and face in a clay basin, then donned his simple linen kilt, its folds neat and white. His reed pens were tucked into a small leather roll, his ink cakes ground fresh from soot and gum. As he stepped into the temple's great courtyard, the sky overhead was already brightening, the first worshippers drifting in to murmur prayers at altars crowned with lotus blossoms and small clay offerings. Nebamun's path led him past towering statues whose eyes gazed forever into the horizon, past walls alive with painted scenes. Fields of grain, flocks of geese, gods with the heads of falcons and cats and crocodiles, all watching in eternal witness. He walked with care, for each step within these sacred walls was a step upon holy ground, the breath of the gods hidden in every carved glyph and secret passage. His first task was always the same, to record the offerings that arrived with the dawn. Barley, onions, jars of honey, wine sealed with clay, baskets of fish and figs. Each item weighed and noted by the priests, each scribe bending over a low table to capture the tribute in lines of careful ink. The temple's wealth did not lie only in gold or precious stone, but in these humble gifts that fed its workers, clothed its priests, and paid for the endless cycle of sacrifice and praise that bound the mortal world to the realm of the divine. Once the scribes finished their tallies, Nebamun carried the tablets to the storehouse, where rows of granaries rose like squat guardians of plenty. There, workers heaved sacks of grain into cool chambers, sealing them against rats and thieves. He moved among them, recording each measure, sometimes helping to lift a sack when an old man's back gave out, though such labor was beneath the dignity of a scribe, at least in the eyes of those above him. Yet Nebamun did not mind the small humiliations. He found a strange peace in the scratching of his reed pen, in the quiet logic that turned chaos into order. Sometimes, when the head scribe allowed, he was trusted with more delicate tasks, drafting prayers for ritual recitations, copying hymns to Ra or Thoth in perfect lines, the ink flowing like the river whose life he chronicled with every mark. But even the temple's hush held shadows. Rumors drifted among the scribes like dust motes in a shaft of sun, whispers of bribes paid by merchants to lessen the tribute owed, of priests skimming offerings to line their own kitchens, of tablets quietly altered in the lamplight to make missing grain vanish from official counts. Nebamun heard these stories with lowered eyes, his heart tight in his chest. He was a good man, or tried to be, but he had a wife and 2 small daughters who waited each evening in their humble home at the edge of the temple district. There were days when a small purse of copper slipped quietly into his hand to look the other way, weighed more heavily than the stone statues that lined the temple's halls. One evening, when the sun sank like molten gold beyond the pylons, Nebamun lingered in the sanctuary's inner court, alone but for the flickering oil lamps and the painted eyes of the gods staring down from the walls. He laid his reed pen aside and knelt before a small altar, its surface smooth from centuries of whispered pleas. He pressed his forehead to the cool stone and asked Thoth, Lord of wisdom and scribes, for forgiveness, for the things he had done, for the things he would yet do to keep his daughters fed. Outside the temple walls, the city murmured in the gathering dusk, market stalls closing, oxen lowing in dusty lanes, distant songs drifting from a courtyard where neighbors gathered to share bread and gossip. Nebamun rose at last, gathered his tablets and pens, and stepped into the night air, heavy with the scent of baking bread and blooming lotus. At home, his daughters ran to greet him, their hands small and sticky with date honey. His wife handed him a bowl of stew, thin but warm, and asked about his day with a knowing smile that needed no words to speak of the quiet burdens they both carried. And Nebamun? the humble scribe, sat among them in the soft glow of an oil lamp, his heart caught between the sacred silence of the gods and the unspoken truths of mortal hunger. So passed another day among the keepers of Egypt's ancient mysteries, men whose careful hands shaped the flow of tribute and sacrifice, who bent their backs not under the sun, but beneath the weight of secrets inked onto fragile scrolls that would crumble to dust long before the stone eyes of the gods closed in sleep. When the soft hush of dawn gave way to the white blaze of noon, there awoke in the hidden corners of Egypt's cities another current of life, one not bound by sacred walls or sun-baked fields, but moving instead through narrow streets and shaded courtyards, through the busy hum of markets where every barter, every whispered promise, carried the scent of survival. In this part of our wandering, we drift with a woman named Meret, whose life wound itself through baskets of reeds, coils of rope, scraps of linen, and whatever else her quick mind could gather and sell. Meret was no noble's wife, no temple scribe's sister. She was simply a seller, a market mother whose stall sat beneath a ragged canopy at the edge of the city's great square. There she spent her days with the hum of flies, the chatter of gossip, and the constant clink of copper that never seemed enough to silence her hunger. Each dawn, Meret woke in a small mud-brick room, its single doorway draped with fraying cloth to keep the wind and sand at bay. Beside her, her two children slept curled together like small dogs, their hair tangled, their bellies often as empty as her own. She would rise while the stars still shivered above the rooftops, tying a faded scarf around her hair, slipping her rough sandals onto feet already cracked from years of market dust. By first light, she walked the narrow lanes that twisted through the poorer quarters, lanes where goats bleated behind wattle fences, where old men squatted beside smoky braziers, roasting scraps of fish too small for the city's fine tables. She would greet her neighbors with a nod, trade a few quiet words, and then gather her wares from the little yard behind her home. Woven baskets she'd crafted by lamplight, lengths of frayed rope cut from cast-offs, and rewoven strong enough to bind jars or bundles of reeds. At the market, the square came alive like a restless hive. Sellers staked out small patches of shade beneath worn awnings, fishmongers shouting over the sharp scent of river catch, potters displaying stacks of clay bowls still warm from the kiln, spice sellers scooping fragrant pinches of cumin and coriander into tiny cloth pouches. Meret slipped into her spot near an old fig tree whose roots cracked the stone beneath her mat. She spread her goods in neat rows, arranged with a care that belied how little coin they fetched. She called to passers-by in a voice at once gentle and sharp, inviting them to feel the weave of her baskets, to test the strength of her rope. Her eyes missed nothing, the fine linen of a noble steward passing by, the heavy purses of priests who might need extra baskets for temple offerings, the young housewives bartering for bread and onions who might spare a copper or two for a coil of rope to tie their goats at night. By midday, the sun poured its full weight upon the market square. Flies gathered in small clouds. Meret wiped sweat from her brow with the corner of her scarf, watching her children chase each other through the stalls, their laughter bright against the grumbled curses of older traders. When they returned hungry, she pressed a piece of flatbread into each small hand, bread paid for with the first coins of the day, gone as quickly as they had come. There were moments when trade slowed, when the heat drove buyers into the cool shadows of nearby arcades. Then Meret would sit, mending her baskets with deft fingers, listening to the drifting stories that rose and fell among her fellow sellers. They spoke of the pharaoh's latest decree, of a neighbor's son taken to serve as a temple guard, of the scribe who cheated his measures at the granary, of the flood's promise or its threat. Gossip was the poor woman's currency, more valuable than copper if one knew how to listen well. When the sun sank behind the temple pylons and the market began to empty, Meret gathered what little remained, baskets unsold, rope still coiled, scraps of linen to mend by lamplight. She tied them into a bundle, slung it over her shoulder, and called to her children, who skipped ahead through the dusk, their small feet raising puffs of dust in the cooling street. At home, she counted her coins in the half-light, 3 or 4 small discs of copper, enough for a little flour, a bit of oil, perhaps a pinch of salt if she bargained well. By night, She sat on her mat near the low hearth, her children pressed against her sides, the small flame dancing shadows across their tired faces. She worked by the flicker of an oil lamp, fingers weaving reeds into tight coils, binding frayed rope ends with clever knots. Her children's heads drooped against her arms until sleep took them, and they curled into the warmth of her side like kittens. Outside, the city slept beneath a blanket of desert stars. Somewhere, the pharaoh's courtiers feasted beneath painted ceilings. In the temples, priests whispered hymns over jars of honey and fresh-cut lotus. But in Merritt's small home, a mother's hands worked on, shaping hope from scraps, weaving tomorrow from the frayed edges of today. And in that quiet, humble labor, there lay a courage the painted gods would never see, but which the night carried gently upon its breath, drifting through the hush of Egypt's dreaming streets. When the hush of night melted once more into the thin gray of morning, another hidden world stirred awake beyond the hum of city markets and the hush of temple courts, a world ruled not by pharaohs or scribes, but by the quiet toil of craftsmen, whose fingers turned rough clay, cold bronze, and simple wood into the tools and treasures that shape daily life. In this stretch of our wandering, we shall follow a man named Hapu, a potter whose small kiln crouched near the edge of a village where the fertile fields gave way to a tangle of reeds and mud along the river's bank. Hapu's dwelling was modest, a single room pressed against the yard where his wheel and kiln squatted like silent sentinels of his trade. By sunrise, the yard was already warm with the breath of last night's fire, the ground littered with broken shards, bits of clay, and half-finished pots waiting for his hands. Hapu was neither rich nor poor by the measure of his neighbors. He ate when he sold well, he tightened his belt when the harvest failed, and always he rose with the sun, muscles stiff but willing, his mind turning as endlessly as his clay wheel. Beside him worked his daughter, Setka, just turned 13. Her small hands quick and clever as she kneaded clay, trimmed rims, and coaxed stubborn lumps into smooth shapes that might hold oil, grain, or water. Each morning, Hapu drew water from the river's edge, careful to skim beneath the reeds where the silt was richest. He mixed it with powdered clay, dug from a pit beyond the fields, pressing and folding the damp mass until it yielded like soft bread dough under his palms. His wheel was simple, a stone disc balanced upon a wooden pivot, spun by the steady tap of his heel. Around him, the village stirred to life. The call of geese, the creak of carts bound for distant markets, the soft chant of women grinding grain behind reed walls. At the wheel, time blurred. The clay spun beneath Hapu's fingers, his thumbs pressing gently to coax a lip from a formless lump, his palms smoothing curves that would cradle precious oil or catch the coolness of water drawn from deep earthen jars. Setka watched every motion, her eyes narrowed in careful study. Sometimes she dared to spin her own small pots beside his, crooked and thin, but growing truer each day under his quiet praise. When the pots were shaped, they sat in neat rows on woven mats beneath the sun. There they dried until their dull skin turned hard enough to face the kiln's breath. Hapu's kiln was an ancient thing, a low dome of sun-baked mud, its mouth blackened by countless firings, its belly forever hungry for scraps of dried reeds and bits of brushwood. When the time came, father and daughter fed the kiln together, squatting on their heels to tend the small flame until it roared bright and fierce, licking the clay with its hot tongue. Heat was a fickle master. Too little, and the pots remained soft, too fragile to hold even a handful of lentils. Too much, and they cracked or warped, their promise shattered into useless shards. Hapu knew the sound of the right flame, the faint whistle in the kiln's throat, the subtle shift in the color of the smoke, as the clay hardened to stone beneath its breath. He taught Setka to watch, to listen, to smell the burn of the reeds and know when the fire had spoken enough. Once the pots were fired, they waited only for buyers, neighbors who needed jars for storing grain against the rats, traders who would carry them downriver to markets where merchants haggled over fish and linen. Some pots were plain, nothing more than honest clay turned to honest use. Others Hapu etched with simple lines, waves for the river, zigzags for the flood, lotus flowers blooming along a narrow rim. These fetched a few more copper coins if fortune was kind. Yet fortune was not always kind. Some seasons the buyers came late or not at all. Sometimes storms ruined the roads, or a noble's levy demanded extra tribute, leaving villagers too poor to spare coin for new pots when old cracked jars could be patched with mud and hope. Then Hapu tightened his belt and sat longer at the wheel, shaping piece after piece, trusting that someone, somewhere, would need what his hands could offer. In the quiet dusk, when the last pot was lifted from the kiln's cooling mouth, Hapu and Setka sat together near the yard's low wall. He mended a cracked jar with fresh clay slip while she traced shapes in the dust, dreaming perhaps of one day selling pots of her own beneath the city's busy arcades, her name carried on the lips of traders who praised her steady hands. Sometimes neighbors drifted over, carrying news of the village, a calf born too early, a field of barley flattened by wind, a cousin called away to work on a distant noble's tomb. They spoke softly, voices weaving through the dusk like the river's quiet song. And always Hapu listened, nodding, adding their worries to his own, feeling the deep pulse of life that tied him not just to clay and flame, but to every back bent beneath the same relentless sun. When night came, he doused the last embers, brushed clay from his fingers, and lay beside his daughter under a simple reed roof. The pots cooled in the dark, waiting for dawn, waiting to carry water, oil, grain, waiting to hold a piece of someone's life in their fired bellies. And so, while kings dreamed of monuments and priests whispered prayers to stone gods, the potter's quiet world turned on. A spinning wheel, a humble kiln, and the hope that tomorrow's hands would need what today's had made. When the first pale glow of dawn brushed the horizon beyond the scattered palms, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the sun would fling its relentless heat across the open sands. Beyond the river's green ribbon, beyond the tidy rows of barley and the clustered mud-brick homes, stretched a world that belonged to the wind and the burning silence. A world where men braved the harsh emptiness to haul forth treasures hidden beneath ancient dunes. This part of our wandering follows one such man, Beck, a miner in the copper pits that pocked the dry hills far from the Nile's gentle embrace. Beck was neither young nor old by the measure of the desert. His face bore deep lines, his hair already salted with gray, though his back still bent strong beneath the sun. Like his father before him, and his father's father before that, Beck rose long before sunrise to gather what meager food he could. Flatbread wrapped in old cloth, a dried onion, a gourd of sour beer, and then trudged out across the open plain toward the low hills where copper hid like secrets beneath unforgiving stone. The mines were no grand quarry, no gleaming tomb. They were narrow scars cut into crumbling rock, their entrances half swallowed by drifting sand. From a distance, they seemed to breathe heat even before the sun touched them fully. Beck joined a line of men at the pit's mouth, lean figures clothed in rough linen, feet wrapped in scraps of hide to guard against sharp stones and scorpions that lurked beneath loose rock. At dawn's edge, the overseer arrived, his stick tapping against a cracked leather tally board. He counted heads, weighed out tools, stone hammers, copper chisels, baskets woven from palm fiber to carry the broken ore. There were no fine words here, no soft prayers to the painted gods of the temples, only the low grunt of men resigning themselves to the long darkness ahead. Beck ducked into the mine's throat, the coolness inside a cruel relief from the growing sun. Inside, the tunnels narrowed until a man could stand only by bending his head or crawling on his belly. The flicker of oil lamps cast monstrous shadows along the rough walls. Each swing of Beck's hammer echoed down cramped shafts where stale air burned in the lungs and dust coated tongue and teeth alike. The work was as old as the desert. Men cracked stone with hammer and wedge, pried loose chunks of ore green with copper or veined with malachite. Baskets filled slowly, carried by boys barely grown, their eyes wide in the half-dark, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they scrambled up narrow shafts to daylight. Outside, other men worked the small smelting hearths, fanning the fire with goatskin bellows, feeding dry brush and dung to coax the flames hot enough to draw the metal from its stony prison. Sometimes, when the heat grew too fierce or the air inside the mine turned foul, Beck would crawl out and sit on a flat rock beneath the searing sun. He would drink deeply from his gourd, chew at his stale bread, and squint across the endless dunes that seemed to swallow all sound. In the distance, a thin line of palm trees hinted at an old well, long dry but still marked on every miner's map like a promise never kept. In these brief moments, Beck would speak quietly to his companion, Dedu, a younger man whose laughter came easily even here, where laughter seemed a forgotten thing. Dedu spoke of his wife waiting near the river, of a daughter born just last flood season who had never seen her father's face by daylight, only in dreams when he returned home covered in dust and sleep-heavy. Beck listened, nodding, knowing the story was not Dedu's alone, but all their stories stitched together, woven from stone, sweat, and the hope that one day this labor might buy a better life for the ones who waited beside the Nile's patient banks. Then the rest was over, and Beck stood once more, wiped grit from his eyes, and slipped back into the mine's swallowing dark. There he swung his hammer in rhythm with his heart, steady as the drip of sweat down his spine, steady as the distant promise of copper turned to blades, chisels, beads for the wealthy who would never stoop to feel the rock's unyielding face. When dusk painted the sky with streaks of blood and copper flame, the miners stumbled from their tunnels like wraiths from the underworld. They left behind the hush of the mine for the silence of the sand, their shadows stretching long upon the wind-swept earth. Beck's hands throbbed with every heartbeat, his fingers raw, his back bent as he slung his hammer across his shoulder and turned for the long walk home. He would reach his village long after the stars gathered above the black ribbon of the Nile. There, in a home little bigger than the mine's tunnels, he would find his wife waiting with a bowl of lentil stew and a quiet blessing whispered over his blistered hands. He would eat, then sink into a sleep so deep it swallowed the aches, if only for a few short hours. And come dawn, the desert would wait for him again, patient and endless, its copper heart buried just beneath the skin of stone, whispering its promise to those willing to bleed their days into the dark. So the miners rose, swung their hammers, fed the flames, and trusted that somewhere beyond the dunes, someone lived softer, because they did not. In the hush of the ancient dawn, the Nile carried its slow secrets past the reed-choked banks, where shadows gathered like whispers. Beneath the cool hush of palm fronds, the peasants stirred before Ra's first rays kissed the sands, for the work of Egypt's heartbeat began when the world was still half dreaming. In this 10th turning of our tale, we drift into the stories of those whose hands shaped the pyramids and temples, yet whose names were swallowed by time as quickly as the desert drinks the rain. It is here, among the farmers, the builders, the servants who bent under a sky of endless sun, that the truth of Egypt's harshness beats the loudest. Consider a young man named Ipuwer, no royal scribe nor noble's son, but a humble farmer's child from a village crouched near the floodplain. His life was bound to the river's moods. In good years, the inundation would spill silt-rich waters across the fields, weaving promise into the soil. In lean years, the river's stinginess would parch the crops to brittle stalks, summoning hunger that stalked the land like a jackal in the dark. Ipuwer rose before dawn each day, his mother's coarse hands brushing dust from his shoulders as she pressed a coarse loaf of barley bread into his palm. He would walk barefoot through mud and sand alike, driving the oxen to till furrows that seemed to stretch into forever. There was no respite from the sun's lash nor the overseer's sharp tongue. Yet worse than the sun were the taxes. The granaries of Pharaoh must be filled, for grain was not merely food but power. Tribute, a currency that paid soldiers, fed priests, and sweetened the lips of visiting envoys. Each harvest brought the tax collector, his sandals soft on the path, yet his presence heavy as stone. He would stand with his reed pen and clay tablet, watching as the villagers stacked their grain. If the pile fell short, excuses found no purchase, only punishment did. In some seasons, Ipuwer's father whispered that the harvest barely fed their own mouths, yet still they must meet their due. To protest was to invite a beating, or worse, a cell in some mud brick outpost where men forgot their names before they ever saw the sky again. And so they labored harder, hoping to coax more from the grudging earth, while praying the river would remember its promises. Beyond the fields, Ipuwer sometimes dreamt of the great stoneworks that rose along the horizon, pyramids and temples so vast they seemed carved from the bones of the earth itself. Men said that Pharaoh was a god, and to build these wonders, was to live forever through the splendor of his tomb. Yet those who hauled the blocks, who mixed mortar under the cruel eyes of foremen, found little immortality in the dust that filled their lungs or the blisters that cracked their flesh. Some laborers were free men, farmers conscripted when the fields lay fallow. Others were captives taken in faraway wars, Libyans, Nubians, Syrians, brought to Egypt in ropes and chains to serve Pharaoh's will. They ate meager rations under the glare of guards. They sang songs to steady the rhythm of pulling stones up earthen ramps, songs that tasted of home yet always ended in the silence of foreign stars. There were moments of mercy, a cool drink of water drawn from deep wells, a loaf of bread shared in secret, a stolen laugh when the foreman's back was turned. But always the task returned, as endless as the sun, the task and the lash. Yet life for the builders was not always chains and cruelty alone. The great tomb cities, like those near Giza, held entire villages for workers. There families lived. Children played among the half-carved stones. Wives baked bread, brewed beer. Wages were paid in bread and beer too, daily sustenance to bind the men to their task. They found small comforts in the company of friends, the warmth of a cook fire, the chance to gossip about Pharaoh's court far away in gilded Memphis. Ippur dreamed of one day joining them, for though the labor was brutal, it offered a steadier lot than the fickle river. To build Pharaoh's house in eternity was to anchor oneself to something larger than a single harvest. But even that hope was shaded with dread. Many died beneath the stones they raised, their bones buried in the desert's hungry belly. No tomb, no name, only a story whispered by wind and shifting sand. Sometimes, under the pale arc of the moon, the elders told tales of the spirits who haunted half-built tombs, angry ghosts of workers who perished unjustly, forever wandering corridors they never finished carving. They said you could hear the tap of their chisels in the silence, a mournful echo of dreams undone. Still, life pressed forward. The Nile would flood again or not, the overseers would come again or not. Pharaoh's demands would rise like the sun, certain, relentless, uncaring of whose back must break to uphold the divine order. So Ipuwer labored on. He listened to the croak of frogs at night, felt the hush of reeds along the canals, dreamed of freedom he could not name. In the marketplace, he glimpsed the nobility, smooth-skinned, scented with oils, wrapped in linen fine as mist. They seemed of another world altogether, yet their ease floated on the sweat of 1,000 Ipuwers who would never set foot in the palace halls. Perhaps, in the hush before dawn, a farmer's boy might wonder why the gods favored some with gold and others with straw. But the thought drifted away like silt on the river's current. In ancient Egypt, the sun rose for Pharaoh, the land bled for Pharaoh, and the people endured because there was no other way. As the stars wheeled overhead and the village fell into uneasy sleep, Ipuwer lay on a mat of reeds, staring into the darkness. Tomorrow would be the same as today, a truth as sure as the river's pull and the desert's thirst. And yet, somewhere in the rhythm of his breath, the timeless murmur of survival whispered on, binding each nameless life to the eternal stone and sand of Egypt's ancient, brutal dream. When the morning mist rose once more from the quiet veins of the Nile, Ipuwer's world stirred with the same soft dread that clung to every threshold. Beneath the canopy of dawn, old women swept the earthen courtyards, their brooms stirring up the scent of last night's hearth and the unyielding dust that always returned. But beyond the fields and the humble huts, another Egypt stirred, an Egypt of silent chambers, painted walls, and prayers whispered over the still bodies of the dead. For even in life's brutal press, death's shadow lay closest. And it was here, in the realm of the embalmers and the tomb carvers, that hardship found its most chilling echo. Far from Ipuwer's village, on the edge of the desert where the ground hardened into cracked, sun-blanched stone, men labored in silence among the tombs. They were called the Keepers of the Passage, and they bore secrets older than any pharaoh's name. They understood that the boundary between life and death was as thin as a reed leaf drifting on water, and twice as easy to tear. Among them worked Menina, a young apprentice to a master embalmer. Menina's father had died building a nobleman's mastaba when Menina was but a child, and so the boy's mother had sent him to the necropolis to serve where the living met the dead. In the hush of the embalming tent, Menina learned to wash the bodies with natron and palm wine, to pack the hollow places with linen and resin. He learned to slit the side and draw out the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each placed in canopic jars crowned with the heads of gods who watched over them through eternity. It was a sacred task, and yet not free of sorrow or fear. Many believed that to dwell too close to the dead was to risk inviting them into your dreams. Sometimes, late at night, Menina would wake beneath his rough linen blanket, certain he felt the gaze of eyes long turned to dust. But when dawn broke, there was no time for fear, only work, endless and exacting. The embalmer's village clung to the edge of the desert like a forgotten sigh. Here, the men worked by day and huddled close to their fires by night, telling stories that wound like smoke through the darkness. They spoke of curses hidden in the tomb walls, of the wrath of spirits disturbed by careless hands. They whispered that sometimes, when the wind howled across the plateau, the cries of those buried without proper rites could be heard among the dunes. Menina knew the truth of this more keenly than most. Once, when he was still a boy sweeping the tent floors, he had stumbled upon a noble's corpse left untended for days, the embalmers delayed by some hidden quarrel. The stench, the flies, he could never forget how quickly flesh surrendered to time when the rites were denied. From that day on, he worked with a devotion born not of piety alone, but of dread, fear that one day, if he erred, his own body might be left to rot beneath the same indifferent sun. While the grand tombs of pharaohs claimed all glory, most Egyptians found little peace in death. For common folk, there were no gilded coffins, no walls painted with prayers and feasts for the afterlife. A simple shroud? Perhaps a modest offering of bread and beer if the family could spare it. This was all that lay between the humble soul and oblivion. Yet the belief in an afterlife burned fierce in every heart, no matter how meager their means. Menina had seen mothers press tokens into the stiff fingers of their children, an amulet, a bead, a scrap of written spell, prayers that the child's spirit might find safe passage through the underworld's terrors. They believed that without such care, the Ka, the soul, would wander lost, forever thirsty, forever hungry, haunting the living for what it could not find in death. Among the embalmers, there were older men whose minds seemed frayed from decades spent near the hush of the dead. They spoke seldom, but when they did, their words carried a weight that pressed on Menina's chest long after. One such man, called Sebek, once told him, "The living fear pain, but the dead fear forgetting. We bind the flesh not for beauty, boy, but to hold the memory of a life together when the soul goes seeking judgment." So Menina learned each cut, each binding, each incantation, his hands steady even when his heart trembled. He knew which herbs to grind and which resins to warm over the coals, scenting the air with a sweetness that barely masked decay. He watched the priests paint sacred signs across linen wrappings, prayers to Osiris and Anubis to guard the path through the Duat, that perilous realm of serpents and flame where the soul must stand trial before Ma'at's feather of truth. Yet for all the reverence, profit lay here too. Families scraped together offerings to pay the embalmers, for a botched mummification was unthinkable. There were rumors of the poorest forced to bury kin in shallow graves, secretly hoping the sands would hide the shame from neighbors and gods alike. Sometimes, thieves found these forgotten places, tearing apart what little protection the poor could muster, stripping amulets from cold necks, disturbing what fragile peace they had paid for with all they owned. So each night, when Menina stepped from the cool darkness of the embalming tent into the wild hush of the desert wind, he felt both pride and burden. He knew he held a piece of eternity in his stained hands. Yet he also felt how fragile that promise was, how easily a spirit could be abandoned if a single coin went unpaid or a single rite went unsaid. In the far-off fields, Ipuwer and his kin bent under the sun for Pharaoh's grain. Here, Menina bent under a different weight. The knowledge that when the breath leaves the body, life's cruelties do not always end. Sometimes they linger, waiting to claim the living who forget that even the dead demand their due. As he lay in his small hut at the necropolis's edge, Menina listened to the sigh of the desert, a sound like distant voices calling from the tombs. He pulled his linen tighter about his shoulders and whispered a prayer that his own Ka, when its time came, might find safe passage through the dark. For in Egypt, to live was to endure. But to die without honor was to be lost forever in the sands that swallowed even kings. By the next crescent moon, the embalmer's village settled deeper into its quiet rhythm, yet beneath its hush, rumors drifted like desert dust, unseen yet everywhere. For all their secrets, the embalmers could not stitch shut the mouths of the living, and so word of the tomb robbers wound its way through both poor huts and noble courts alike. It was said that in the blackest hours before dawn, bands of desperate men crept into the necropolis with tools of iron and hearts hardened by hunger. They slipped past sleeping guards and careless watchmen, prying open stone seals meant to last eternity. A single gold amulet, a strip of fine linen, a precious stone wrested from the brow of a long-dead noble could feed a starving family for months. If they could find a traitor bold enough to take it, and luck enough to avoid the pharaoh's wrath. In the swirl of such rumors, Menina kept his head low and his thoughts quieter still. Yet each morning when he returned to his master's tent, he could not help but notice fresh signs, a tomb seal cracked, a footprint in the drifting sand where none should be. He and the other apprentices never spoke of it aloud, for the punishment for such crimes was dreadful, not only for the thief, but for any soul who knew and failed to tell. One dusk, as Menina swept out the last traces of natron dust, Sebek the Elder called him aside. By the wavering light of an oil lamp, Sebek's face seemed carved from the same stone as the tomb walls he had served all his life. His eyes, pale with the cloud of age, fixed on Menina's hands that had grown deft and steady, hands that now trembled beneath the old man's gaze. "Boy," Sebek rasped, his voice a rasp like dry papyrus. "Do you know why the pharaoh's curse was carved on the tomb doors?" Menina shook his head. Though he had heard the stories, how the curse would strike down the desecrator, stealing his breath, breaking his line, blighting his cattle, drawing his name from the book of life so that he might wander forever in the darkness beyond. Sebek lifted a finger wrapped in yellowed linen where a cut had never quite healed. "It is not for the thief. It is for the fearful, for the living. Men must be reminded that nothing is truly safe, not even in death. The gods guard what men cannot. And yet," his voice trailed off into a brittle laugh, "and yet, even the gods sleep sometimes, and hunger keeps no reverence." Menina swallowed hard, for he knew what Sebek meant. The greatest threat to the dead did not always come from strangers in the night, but from those who knew the tomb's secrets too well. Sometimes, it was the very men who built the vaults and bound the mummies who slipped back under moonlight, driven by debts or bribes or sheer despair. Beyond the necropolis, life in the villages grew harsher that season. The flood had been poor, the grain thin on the stalks. In Ipuwer's village, families whispered of empty granaries and the taxman's shadow growing longer than any palm tree. Children's bellies swelled not with food but with hunger's cruel trick. Under such strain, virtue bent like a reed in the river's pull. Ipuwer himself had heard of a cousin who vanished one night, walking toward the necropolis with a gang of men armed with chisels and flickering hopes. He never came back, and no one spoke of him again. In Egypt, silence was often the only protection left to the powerless. Meanwhile, the tombs still rose in solemn grandeur. New chambers were carved deeper into the cliffs, painted with spells and feasting scenes meant to guard the noble dead in the eternity to come. Menina sometimes paused at the foot of a freshly painted wall, tracing the gods with his gaze. Anubis, jackal-headed and silent, Isis with her wings spread in sorrowful embrace. He wondered if they watched all this mortal struggle, or if they too turned their eyes away when hunger drove a man to defile the very thing he had built. One bitter night, the embalmers gathered around a low fire outside their tents. The wind bit through their thin cloaks, carrying with it the ghostly howls of jackals, far out in the dunes. They sat close, passing a jug of sour beer between them, their faces ruddy from the flame's flicker. One of the younger apprentices asked, voice muffled behind his cup, "Master Sebek, have you ever seen the curse strike a robber down?" Sebek's cracked lips curled into something like a smile. He looked at the youth, then at Menina, then past them all, into the black swell of the desert night. "I have seen a man stand unafraid before the god's curse," Sebek murmured, his voice a dry wind. He took gold from a noble's mouth with his own hands, walked away laughing. For 3 days he feasted like a prince. On the 4th day, He was found face down in the canal, his eyes gone to the fish. A hush fell then, deeper than the dark around them. The fire popped, spitting sparks that danced into the cold air like fleeting souls. Menina clutched his cloak tighter and wondered if the story was true, or if it was simply another curse, spoken not by gods but by old men who knew that fear sometimes was the only chain strong enough to hold desperate hands at bay. In the weeks that followed, the necropolis guards doubled their rounds. New warnings were etched in hieroglyphs on fresh plaster, dire threats of divine vengeance for any who dared disturb the sleep of the chosen dead. But the desert knew better. It swallowed the footprints by dawn, blurred the edges of broken seals, hid the tracks of men who gambled their souls against hunger's gnaw. And so, in the hush of the embalmer's tent, Menina worked on, binding, washing, anointing, sealing up the dead against time's cruel teeth, even as he wondered whether any shroud could ever be strong enough to hold back the living. Beneath his breath, he whispered prayers to Anubis, that jackal-faced guardian who watched the threshold no mortal gate could guard forever. In ancient Egypt, the living bent beneath the sun, and the dead slept in tombs that were never quite closed, no matter how many curses carved their stone doors shut. Far from the hushed secrets of the necropolis, the city of Memphis stirred like a living tapestry at dawn, woven of merchants' cries, clattering carts, and the slow chant of priests greeting the rising sun. Here, life's brutal edges were softened not by ease but by the illusion of splendor, a grand stage where noblemen, traders, scribes, and beggars all drifted like motes of dust in Ra's golden flood. In this part of Egypt's beating heart lived Tia, a servant girl within the sprawling estate of a wealthy official whose name was whispered in both envy and dread. To look upon Tia was to see a child of no remarkable birth, skin burnished by years beneath linen canopies, feet hardened by cool tiles and scalding courtyards, eyes quick to lower before a master's gaze. Yet behind those lowered lashes, thoughts stirred as restless as the Nile in flood. Tia's mother had been a wet nurse, her father a donkey driver who vanished into the desert on an ill-fated caravan. She had grown among other children in the servant quarters, a place half shadow, half noise, where gossip drifted like incense and lessons were learned by the crack of a reed stick on the back of a hand. Now, barely 15 summers old, Tia had learned well how to move like a whisper through the grand house, how to pour wine without spilling a drop, how to vanish her own hunger behind a practiced smile. Her master, Lord Pacer, was a man who wore his piety like a cloak of gold. He spoke often of Ma'at, the divine order that bound Egypt together, yet his wealth dripped from the calloused hands of those far below his marble floors. His storehouses groaned with grain, even as the flood failed, his granaries guarded by men whose spears gleamed brighter than any offering he placed at the temple. Tia's work was endless. At dawn, she carried basins of cool water for her mistress's bath. She polished alabaster jars of scented oil, swept courtyards littered with fallen hibiscus blossoms, lit lamps that cast flickering halos over walls painted with lotus and papyrus. She moved among dancers and singers at feasts, yet tasted none of the honeyed dates or roasted duck she passed on silver trays. When she lay down to sleep, it was on a thin mat in a corner of the servants' quarters, pressed between bodies that shivered in winter and sweated in the furnace of high summer. Even then, sleep was a brittle thing. A single cough from her mistress, a snap of fingers in the dark, and she was awake, rising without question to tend to needs that were never her own. Yet, within the quiet moments, Tia watched. She watched the scribes slip behind closed doors to tally Lord Pacer's accounts, watched how the overseers carried secrets in hushed voices, gifts for priests, bribes for officials, extra sacks of barley hidden when the taxmen came. She listened to the cooks' muttered curses over half-empty storerooms, to the slaves who whispered of children sold to settle debts. In a world of painted walls and gold-tipped reed pens, the truth of Egypt's brutal coin lay not only in sweat and blood, but in the hush of things never spoken aloud. One night, when the lotus lamps burned low, Tia lingered in the courtyard after all others had gone. She knelt to scrub the stone where wine had spilled during her master's latest feast, a gathering of men whose words dripped honey when they spoke of Pharaoh, yet tasted of iron when they turned to the peasants who worked the land they counted as their own. As she scrubbed, she looked up to the stars. Sharp, clear, unblinking. Somewhere out there, her father's bones might lie bleaching beneath shifting dunes. Somewhere, she thought, the gods must surely watch. Yet what had they done for her mother, who died coughing in her sleep with no priest at her side, no offering on her tongue? What did they do for her now, scrubbing stones slick with wine she would never taste? Tia's thoughts were broken by the sudden crunch of sandals on gravel. She stiffened, dropping her gaze as the overseer loomed above her, a man with a face as dry and lined as a weathered scroll. His hand gripped her arm, not cruelly, but with the weight of unspoken warning. "Get up, girl," he said, voice low but edged like flint. "If Lord Passer finds you idle, he'll have your back striped again." Tia swallowed her retort. She rose, hands red and raw from the stone's bite. The overseer's eyes flicked to the half-scrubbed stain, then to her face. In that glance, Tia felt something cold coil in her belly, something that was not fear alone, but the first sting of understanding, that in this house of marble columns and painted gods, she was both necessary and invisible. She returned to her mat in the servant quarters long after the courtyard fell silent, curling herself around her own breath, the scent of wine and sweat still clinging to her skin. Around her, others stirred in uneasy sleep. Maids, errand boys, cooks, all bound by the same unspoken truth. They were gears in a machine whose shining face the world admired, but whose grinding teeth fed on bone and hope alike. And yet, beneath the hush of that stone estate, Tia's thoughts drifted like the slow swirl of silt in the river. She did not have a scribe's pen, nor a noble's seal, nor a soldier's blade. But she had eyes and ears, and the soft-footed patience of one who had always been overlooked. As the first whispers of dawn brushed the sky pale, Tia lay awake and watched the flicker of oil lamps in the halls beyond her door. The world beyond might belong to Pharaoh and the gods, to men like Lord Pacer with vaults full of barley and copper rings. But she, too, was Egypt's child, and one day, she thought, even the smallest reed might find the current strong enough to carry it beyond the reach of marble floors and whispering masters. For now, though, she rose at the call of the rooster, pulled her linen tight around her shoulders, and stepped once more into the hush of the house, where life gleamed bright on the walls but wore its cruelest face in the shadows behind them. When the sun next rose above Memphis, its rays struck the temple pylons first, broad stone gates painted with figures of gods and kings, locked forever in battles older than memory. The sacred courtyard soon filled with the murmur of priests, their linen robes whispering against smooth sandstone, their feet bare upon floors washed each dawn with water drawn from the Nile's sacred veins. Amid these cloisters of incense and chanting walked Beck, a temple scribe whose reed pen danced between papyrus and the eternal hush of stone. Beck was neither noble nor peasant. He lived in that narrow world between, where knowledge gave a man status, but never the freedom the nobles claimed by birth alone. His father had been a scribe too, his mother the daughter of a brickmaker. For Beck, the temple walls were both sanctuary and cage. Each morning he sat cross-legged on a cool slab within the House of Life, where scribes copied prayers older than the oldest tomb. He recorded the deeds of nobles who paid offerings for a place among the gods, drafted letters that wove alliances like reeds into baskets, and tallied offerings brought by humble villagers who hoped a handful of grain might buy the gods mercy in the season to come. Yet Beck's work was not only ink and prayer. Within the deeper chambers, where the common worshippers could not tread, secrets whispered among the painted pillars. He knew how the temple's wealth grew fat while the fields grew thin, knew which priests sold sacred oil twice over, which guardians of Ma'at turned a blind eye to merchants who paid well to weigh their goods beneath the statues of Thoth. In Egypt, corruption often wore the same linen as holiness. Still, Beck was no fool. He held his tongue and bent his head low. Each day he dipped his reed in soot-black ink and pressed symbols onto fresh papyrus, prayers for the dead, spells for the living, records that said the world was orderly, when in truth, order was a thin crust over a restless sea. It was on such a day, warm with the hum of cicadas beyond the temple walls, that Beck found himself called to the sanctuary of the high priest, a chamber heavy with scent of frankincense, and the hush of stone statues whose eyes watched yet never wept. The high priest, Miru, was a man whose gaze seemed to strip the skin from a man's thoughts. Beck knelt, heart thumping like a drum in his throat. "Beck," Miru said, voice calm as still water. "You are diligent. You write with a steady hand. You listen well." He paused, tapping a finger on a scroll bound in red cord. "Yet you see too much." Beck's mouth dried at once. He lowered his eyes to the polished floor, watching a beetle scuttle across the pale stone. "I serve the gods, Great One. I write only what is commanded." "Just so," Miru murmured. He leaned forward, shadows gathering in the hollows of his face. "Remember, scribe, words have teeth sharper than any blade. A careless word can bury a man deeper than any tomb." Beck bowed low until his forehead brushed cool stone. He knew the threat for what it was. A reminder that the pen which lifted him above the fields could just as easily become the chisel that carved his name from life. When he rose and backed from the chamber, the air outside felt thin, as though the gods themselves had pressed the breath from his chest. Returning to his work, Beck dipped his pen once more, tracing signs that sang of Ra's mercy, of Osiris's promise, of Ma'at's perfect balance. Yet behind each symbol flickered the truth he dared not write, that power bent even the gods to mortal hands, that gold could silence prayers, that men like Miru wove nets of piety only to catch more silver in their grasp. When his work was done, Beck slipped from the temple's shadow into Memphis's bustling streets. He passed merchants hawking garlic and fish, saw beggars crouched beside alabaster walls that gleamed like sunlit bones. He paused at a narrow stall where a potter's boy shaped clay into small figurines, gods and animals, offerings for those too poor to buy temple blessings. Beck watched the boy's hands, quick and clever, coaxing a jackal's head from spinning mud. He wondered, not for the first time, if the simple gods of clay heard prayers more truly than the gilded idols behind the temple pylons. At night, Beck returned to his modest chamber, a mud brick room above a courtyard where papyrus dried in neat bundles. He sat cross-legged on his reed mat, his oil lamp guttering as insects battered themselves against its flickering glow. In secret, on scraps too small for official eyes, he sometimes wrote words no priest could approve. Words that asked what good was order when it fed some and starved so many others. Words that wondered whether the scales of Ma'at were always just, or if they too tipped beneath the weight of hidden gold. When he heard footsteps in the courtyard, Beck would scatter these scraps into the brazier's coals, watching the smoke curl into the night sky where no pharaoh's scribe could follow. There, perhaps, the truth might drift freely, caught in the ears of whatever spirit still cared for a land that called itself the gift of the Nile. In Memphis, the dawn came swift and relentless. Each new day found Beck once more bent over fresh scrolls, pen scratching the record of Egypt's glories. But within him, a slow, restless tremor grew, a question ink could not contain, a secret more enduring than stone. For in this land, where temples rose and tombs sealed shut the dreams of kings, even a humble scribe could feel the brutal truth, that to know too much was to risk becoming a ghost long before the gods weighed his heart against the feather of Ma'at. When the summer winds turned fierce and dry, carrying the desert's breath deep into the streets of Memphis, life within the palace walls of Pharaoh's court moved like a river of silk over stone, beautiful to behold but treacherous beneath the sheen. In this swirl of incense and intrigue lived Neferet, a concubine whose beauty was matched only by her silence. Neferet had been brought to the palace when she was scarcely more than a girl, chosen from a village far south along the bend of the Nile, where crocodiles lazed in the reeds and fishermen sang prayers to Sobek at dawn. Her father, a fisherman himself, had traded her in the leanest season, a decision wrapped in tears and prayers for forgiveness that drifted downriver long after his boat returned alone. In the palace, Neferet learned quickly that beauty was not her shield, but her leash. She was bathed in perfumed oils until her skin gleamed like polished alabaster, draped in linen as fine as spider silk, her hair dark and heavy with fragrant unguents that marked her as a favored blossom in Pharaoh's secret garden. Yet behind the coal-lined eyes, her thoughts moved with the quiet cunning of the river's undercurrent. She learned the names of the women who ruled without crowns, older concubines whose whispers reached Pharaoh's ear when the viziers dared not. She saw how gifts of scent and song were offered like weapons, how laughter in the harem could turn to poison with a single careless word. By day, she drifted through shaded courtyards, moving like a heron through shallows, graceful, untouchable, yet always watched. By night, she lay upon a bed softer than any she'd known by the river's edge, staring at a ceiling painted with blue stars that mocked the real ones hidden by the palace walls. Sometimes Pharaoh called for her, and she went to him as softly as water over stone, her voice low and sweet, her touch scented with myrrh and lotus. He spoke to her not as a man, but as a god, his words filled with decrees and half-formed dreams of new temples, new wars, new suns to bind his name to eternity. Neferet listened. She murmured agreement, laughter, wonder, never truth. For she knew that her beauty was fleeting, a blossom easily plucked and replaced by one fresher, softer, more pliant. To survive was to keep secrets sealed behind downcast lashes. Beyond the harem walls, she sometimes heard the rumble of the city, a distant drumbeat of carts, traders, and the low chant of supplicants at the temple gates. Rumors slipped through the servants like stray grains of sand, harvests failing, taxes rising, nobles scheming against one another in quiet gardens where poisoned figs waited behind innocent leaves. Within these walls, such troubles seemed far away. Servants poured wine from jars painted with gods that mocked the thirst of the peasants outside. Musicians plucked at lyres strung with gut, while dancers swayed like reeds in the delta wind. But Neferet's ears, keen as any hawk's, caught the worry beneath the laughter, the fear that if Pharaoh's grip weakened, the palace would devour itself from within. One sultry evening, as the sun bled its last light into the river, Neferet was summoned to the queen's private garden. She went barefoot across polished stones, the hem of her linen robe whispering secrets to the floor. The garden was a hush of green in the desert's teeth. Sycamore fig trees, lotus pools, the scent of frankincense drifting like a ghost. There, beneath the branches, the queen waited. She was older than Neferet by a score of years, her face lined like a map of storms weathered and survived. Her eyes, dark and unyielding, fixed Neferet like a falcon pinning a lizard in the dust. "You are favored," the queen said, her voice smooth but sharp. "You are Pharaoh's little river blossom. You know his secrets." Neferet lowered her gaze to the stones, heart fluttering like a bird against a cage. "I am nothing, Majesty. I am as he wills me." The queen's laugh was soft and cold. "All women here are as he wills, until he tires of willing it so. Listen to me, pretty flower. There are ears everywhere. There are always new mouths to whisper poison into Pharaoh's dreams. And there are always eyes, my eyes, that see when a blossom forgets her place." Neferet knelt until her forehead brushed the smooth, warm stone. Beneath the queen's heavy gaze, she felt the truth she had always known but never spoken, that in this palace of painted walls and silk screens, a woman's beauty could bring a life of ease, but only if she wielded it with the wisdom of a serpent coiled beneath lotus petals. When she returned to her chamber that night, Neferet lay in the hush of oil lamps and cooling perfumes. Outside her window, the Nile moved in darkness, carrying silt and secrets from lands she would never see again. She traced the patterns on the silk pillow, her mind drifting to the river village she could barely recall. Her mother's rough hands, her father's sad eyes as he turned his boat from the shore. She wondered if they still spoke her name in the hush of dawn, if they believed she lived like a goddess among gods. They could not know that beauty here was another hunger, one that fed on youth until nothing sweet remained but memory. When the lamps guttered out, Neferet closed her eyes and listened to the palace breathe around her, stone and silk, lies and lullabies, all woven into a life she could not escape but might, if she listened well enough, survive. In the world beyond the painted walls, peasants bled in the fields, scribes bent beneath the weight of hidden truths, builders broke their backs for tombs they'd never enter. Here, in Pharaoh's harem, Neferet learned that life in ancient Egypt could wear silk and gold and smell of lotus, and still cut just as deep as any lash beneath the burning sun. When the breath of autumn touched the Nile's banks, a hush fell over the floodplains where stalks of barley bent beneath the weight of ripening grain. In these weeks of harvest, the land seemed to exhale, a brief moment when the earth's grudging gifts were gathered in baskets, weighed and counted under watchful eyes. But for many, the turning of the seasons was not relief, but reckoning. Among those who toiled under the scalding sky was a man named Sinmut, a tenant farmer whose ancestors had carved canals with bare hands and hope, binding their fates to Pharaoh's endless hunger. Sinmut's back was broad but bent, his skin burnt dark by 1,000 days beneath Ra's merciless eye. He was no longer young, yet not old enough to escape the overseer's shouted orders. In the hush before dawn, Sinmut rose from the reed mat beside his wife and 2 children, slipping out before the first cock crowed. His wife, Merit, watched him go in the gloom, clutching their youngest close as though warmth could be conjured from skin alone. Their eldest son, barely taller than the grain stalks, would follow Sinmut soon enough, barefoot across the brittle fields. By midday, the fields shimmered like a waking dream, waves of gold beneath a white sun that seemed to mock every drop of sweat it drew. Sinmut's hands moved with a rhythm older than memory, the sickle's edge biting through stalk after stalk, the grain falling into neat bundles bound with coarse twine. Around him, neighbors worked shoulder to shoulder, some kin, some strangers, all bound by the same unspoken truth that the Pharaoh's share would come first, and theirs only if the scales balanced kindly. From the edge of the fields, the overseer watched, mounted on a lean horse shaded by a servant's fan. He barked reminders when arms slowed, counted bushels with eyes sharp as any hawk's. When the piles rose too slowly, he called for the stick, a crooked staff of acacia that cracked across backs already slick with sweat. Sinmut kept his head low, his mouth shut. He remembered when his own father once spat in the dust at an overseer's feet, a moment of defiance that earned him shackles and weeks digging irrigation ditches far from the fields he'd called his own. He came back thin as a stalk left too long in the sun, coughing blood into the reeds until one night the coughing stopped. The fields took him back, just as they did the silt, the wind, the bones of nameless beasts who labored under the same sky. As the sun fell and shadows stretched long and forgiving, Sinmut carried his share of the day's harvest to the granary, an adobe storehouse guarded by scribes with tablets and board expressions. The scribes marked each bundle, their styluses scratching out the measure of a man's year in symbols neat as snake tracks in the sand. One scribe, a youth with smooth hands and coal dark eyes, barely glanced at Sinmut as he added a mark to his clay tablet. "Your yield is short this year, farmer." Sinmut bowed his head. "The flood was late, scribe. The fields gave what they could." The youth did not look up. "Pharaoh's share will not shrink for your excuses. Perhaps next season you will coax more from your soil." Sinmut said nothing more. He shouldered his empty basket and walked back through the twilight, the fields whispering behind him as night birds called from the reeds. In his mind, he measured the grain he would keep, the mouths it must fill, the days before the overseer's stick found its mark again if he failed. At home, Merit waited by a flickering oil lamp, the children asleep beside her. She took the basket from his weary arms, found it light, but said nothing. Words were thin comfort against an empty store jar. She pressed her palm to his cheek instead, rough hands meeting rough skin, a small gesture that spoke louder than any prayer. Later that night, when the fields lay black beneath the moon's pale blessing, Sinmut stepped outside their mud brick hut. He stood in the cool hush, staring at the endless stars scattered above the dark, rippling hush of the canals. Somewhere beyond those stars, the gods watched, or so the priests swore, their lips rich with offerings Sinmut's labor fed. But for a man with cracked hands and children to keep warm, the stars felt as far away as Pharaoh's golden throne. He thought of the harvest yet to come, the floods that might fail again, the overseer's stick waiting like a promise. He thought of his son, bones too thin for his years, eyes bright with questions Sinmut could not answer. He wondered if one day the boy would stand here in this same darkness, asking the same bitter questions of the same silent sky. And yet, despite the ache in his back, the hunger that waited behind every corner of his door, Sinmut turned back inside. He lay beside Merit, who pressed her warmth against him without words, and felt her breath slow, felt the small shape of his child curled against his legs. For in ancient Egypt, the land could be cruel, the river fickle, the taxman ruthless. But in these small moments, when husband and wife shared the hush of night, when children dreamed unknowing of the burdens waiting for their shoulders, there was a stubborn spark that even Pharaoh's scales could not weigh or measure. a whisper that life, though brutal, could still find a way to rise from the dust like barley stalks bending but unbroken beneath the sun's relentless gaze. Beyond the quiet hum of the village fields and the hush of palace gardens, the desert stretched vast and indifferent, a sea of shifting gold that swallowed the footsteps of men and the echoes of forgotten kingdoms alike. It was here, on the ragged edge where habitable land surrendered to dunes, that a different breed of people carved out their existence: the desert traders. Among them rode Amuni, a caravan master whose face was burned to leather by the sun and wind, whose eyes had learned to read dunes like a scribe reads a sacred scroll. His life was a thread stretched between oasis and city, risk and reward, a gamble played beneath a sky that never blinked. Amuni's caravan gathered at dawn, camels groaning under their burdens, skins of water, bundles of incense, baskets of dried dates, fine copper tools from distant mines. Each man wore the desert's dust like a second skin, scarves wrapped tight to ward off the sun's merciless tongue. Their trade was not only goods, but secrets. Whispers carried between far-off settlements, news of border skirmishes, rumors of a noble's betrayal sealed in a merchant's wink. The desert was a highway for the bold and a grave for the careless. Sandstorms could rise like a god's wrath, swallowing whole lines of beasts and men. Thieves haunted the lonely passes, drawn by the promise of gold hidden beneath camel hides. And yet, Amuni returned to this harsh road again and again, for within these dunes lay a freedom denied to peasants chained to fields and scribes bound to temples. As the sun climbed that morning, the caravan snaked out from the last cluster of palms. The oasis behind them faded to a memory of green and trickling water. Ahead lay days of blinding light and freezing nights where men huddled close to flickering fires, their laughter brittle, their eyes darting at each distant howl. Amuni's thoughts drifted as his camel plodded onward. He remembered when his father first led him into the desert, a boy perched atop a swaying beast, clutching its rough fur with knuckles white as linen. His father's voice had been low and steady. "Out here, boy, the sand is honest. It gives nothing freely and takes nothing you haven't offered first." Those words had carried him through storms that stripped skin raw, through nights when thieves pressed blades to his throat in the hush between stars. They had carried him through betrayals by men he'd called brother when gold gleamed brighter than loyalty. And still he came back. For what other life offered a man the wind's song for company and the taste of risk to sharpen each breath? By noon, the caravan paused in the shadow of a rocky outcrop, the only refuge for miles. The men fed their beasts handfuls of dry fodder, shared water in measured sips. Amuni sat apart on a slab of stone, a strip of dried fish between his teeth, eyes narrowed at the distant shimmer of heat on the horizon. One of his men, Kabi, crouched beside him, young, sharp-eyed, reckless enough to test the patience of the gods. "Master," Kabi murmured, voice low as the shifting sand, "they say bandits camp near the western pass. Half-starved dogs sniffing for fool's fat with incense and copper." Amuni snorted. "Then we shall not be fools." He chewed slowly, savoring the salt that cut through the desert's dry taste. "We'll swing north at dusk, ride the old riverbed, harder on the beasts but safer for our throats." Kebi grinned, teeth flashing white beneath his dust-cloaked face. "They say your eyes see ghosts in the dunes, master." Amuni's lips twitched at that. Better ghosts than knives in the dark. When dusk bled the sky to violet, they rose again, turning away from the well-trodden route. The night fell cold, the desert's furnace cooling to a biting wind that rattled the bells tied to the camels' harnesses. Stars burned overhead in cruel, distant brilliance, each one a silent witness to the small flicker of fire that marked the traders' camp. Around that fire, the men spoke of families left behind, wives waiting by quiet wells, children chasing goats in dusty yards. Some spoke of gold they would spend on fine linen, sweet beer, a new donkey, or a bracelet to charm a lover. Amuni listened, adding nothing. For him, the desert was the only mistress he trusted, her favors hard-won and fleeting. When all grew quiet but for the restless snort of camels, Amuni lay wrapped in his cloak, staring at the stars etched like cold jewels on the black skin of the sky. He wondered if Pharaoh's scribes ever marked the passage of men like him, whose footprints vanished before dawn, whose names never brushed the palace walls. He wondered if the priests who burned incense in shaded temples knew that it first passed through hands like his, bartered grain for resin beneath some thorn tree, while jackals watched from the shadows. The wind sighed over the dunes, shifting them grain by grain, an empire built and unbuilt with each restless gust. Amuni closed his eyes, the desert's hush a lullaby no court musician could ever match. Here, beyond the reach of Pharaoh's taxes, scribes' ink, and nobles' cunning, life was still brutal. But it was his own. And in the raw taste of danger and the promise of gold hidden beneath the next horizon, Amuni found a freedom as vast and unforgiving as the desert itself. At the place where the desert's edge surrendered again to fields and canals, where the hush of dunes gave way to the murmuring reeds and frogs hidden in the dusk, there lay a settlement older than its crumbling walls, an outpost between shifting sands and Pharaoh's beating heart. Here lived a people neither fully of the fields nor wholly of the wandering sands. They were the ferrymen, the keepers of the river's secret crossings. Among them was Hori, whose family had poled rafts across the Nile for as long as anyone could remember. His father's father had ferried soldiers bound for Nubian wars. His mother's kin ferried grain and cattle, the living and the dead alike, for a price agreed with the nod of a chin and the slap of a calloused palm. Hori's days began before the sun broke the horizon, when the air still clung to the chill of night, and the river mist drifted like breath from the underworld's gate. He would stand barefoot on the weathered planks of his flat-bottomed boat, his pole pressing into the riverbed's silt, shoulders straining as he guided merchants, farmers, scribes, and pilgrims from one shifting bank to the other. By day, the ferry carried laughter, gossip, prayers, mothers clutching baskets of bread, old men leading goats that bleated at the river's cold kiss. By night, the same boat might drift beneath the hush of stars, its planks burdened by wrapped shapes bound for burial grounds upriver, bodies washed, shrouded, and paid for in small coins that clinked cold in Hori's palm. He had grown used to the weight of the living and the dead alike. The river made no distinction. It took back what it gave, carrying both grain and ghost on its slow, silt-heavy breath. One dusk, as Hori waited by the landing, he watched a noble's barge drift past. Its sides lacquered with bright paint that caught the setting sun like flame on black water. Within its curtained canopy lounged a merchant's widow, her wrists heavy with gold bangles, her eyes drifting over Hori as if he were no more than a post in the mud. He dipped his pole in mute respect, though her gaze never settled on his face, fixed instead on the horizon, where Memphis's temples rose like teeth against the dying light. When she passed, Hori spat softly into the river, a habit his father taught him to ward off envy. A man who watches their gold too long forgets his own feet in the mud, his father used to say. So Hori turned back to his work, guiding a basket seller and her daughter across to the far bank where market stalls waited like hungry mouths. That night, he lingered longer than usual on the landing. The river's hush soothed him, the frogs and nightbirds striking up their hidden chorus. He leaned on his pole, staring at the dark sweep of water, thinking of his father's stories, of times when the river's crossing was a passage not only of boats, but of rumors, goods smuggled past watchful scribes, words that could topple men in white linen if they drifted into the wrong ears. In the shallows near his feet, fish flickered like silver ghosts. Hori wondered if one day his own name would vanish down here too. No stone, no painted tomb, just a handful of stories clinging to the reeds until the current pulled them away. He turned when footsteps squelched in the mud behind him. It was Ka, an old friend and sometimes partner in quiet ventures that earned more than the daily ferrying of honest folk. Ka's grin gleamed in the starlight, all teeth and secrets. "Good crossing tonight, Hori?" "Quiet," Hori said, watching Ka's shadow dance on the water. "Just the way I like it." Ka squatted near the prow, trailing his fingers in the cold ripple. "I heard of a thing, a merchant's cargo, fine oil and honey, headed south at dawn, no guards worth speaking of, a quiet crossing. Just a delay here, a whisper there, and we take our share before the city scribes ever miss it." Hori studied the man's face, sharp lines carved by hunger and chance. He remembered the ferryman's oath. Carry all things, ask no questions, keep the river's secrets sealed. But the oath fed no bellies when the flood failed, when Pharaoh's collectors demanded tribute with soft smiles and hard sticks. "You in?" Ka pressed, voice low as the frogs beyond the reeds. Hori said nothing at first. He gazed out where the river disappeared into darkness, where the moon laid a silver path that no barge nor pharaoh could claim. His father's ghost seemed to sigh from the water's hush, warning and forgiving in the same breath. At last, he nodded. "One crossing, no more, if the river keeps our secret." Ka's grin widened. "The river keeps everything, brother, until it doesn't." They parted with nothing more than a nod. The plan folded like a reed boat and set adrift on the current. Hori pushed his pole into the shallows once more, steadying the old ferry for Dawn's honest labor. Above him, the stars wheeled silent and cold, indifferent to what men stole or gave or lost on the water's slow, eternal breath. For in Egypt, the Nile was life and grave alike, a hush that promised survival yet swallowed all things in time. And so Hori, like countless before him, trusted his secrets to the dark water, knowing well that the river kept no oaths but its own. Far to the south, beyond the busy fields of the delta and the restless hum of the great cities, there lay a stretch of land that few dared to linger in. Here, the Nile narrowed and twisted, curling around stones as ancient as the sky itself. The banks rose high, rough with cliffs and caves, where only the hardiest of souls carved out an existence. It was in these shadowed places, so far from the palaces and temple courts, that another side of Egyptian life unfolded. A life that was not gilded with gold or softened by silks, but hardened by the unforgiving edge of survival. In this harsh realm, a family of stonecutters labored beneath the sun. The father, Menes, was a man whose skin had been baked dark by decades at the quarry face. His shoulders bore a lattice of old scars, earned from chisel slips and falling stone. His wife, Iset, tended their tiny plot of earth, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the sand, while keeping watch for snakes that slithered from the rocky clefts. And there was their son, little Kahotep, whose eyes were too large for his thin face, a child of 8 seasons who already knew the weight of a pick in his hands. Each dawn began before the stars had yielded. Menes would rise, feeling the ache of old wounds in his bones. He would touch his sleeping wife's hair, coarse with dust, and linger by his son's side, brushing away the fine sand that drifted in through the cracks of their stone hut. Then, lantern in hand, he would make his way to the quarry's mouth, where shadows swallowed him whole. The quarry was a pit of ceaseless echoes. Men shouted warnings over the sound of hammers biting into bedrock. Chisels rang like crude bells, keeping time in a place where hours slipped away unnoticed. Dust rose in shimmering clouds, drifting up to catch the first rays of the morning sun. Here, the pharaoh's grandest monuments began as rough blocks coaxed from the earth by countless hands, hands that cracked, bled, and stiffened until they could lift no more. It was no life of glory. There was no priest to bless the stonecutters' toil, no offerings laid at their feet. Their work fed the dreams of kings, yet their names would not be carved alongside the hieroglyphs. If a block tumbled and pinned a man beneath it, he might be buried where he fell, the stone itself becoming his grave. And still, more would come, drawn by hunger sharper than any chisel's edge. One evening, when the sun had slipped behind the cliffs, Menes stumbled home with his tunic torn and his forearm wrapped in a rag. Iset sat him on a mat by the threshold, dipping a cloth in water warmed over a low fire. Kahotep watched, wide-eyed and silent, as his mother unwound the bloody rag. The wound was deep, cut by a splintered flint. Iset cleaned it with careful hands, whispering prayers to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who might spare them fever. Menes did not cry out. He watched the flicker of firelight on the rough walls and thought of the pharaoh's tomb, how many stones it would need, how many men it would consume. His son's fingers curled around his own calloused hand. In Kahotep's eyes burned questions that had no answers. Why must our lives be given so freely, so unnoticed? What good was all this labor if tomorrow the sand would cover their footprints and the cliffs would outlast their bones? Yet the boy was already learning what his father could not say aloud, that in this land one did not hope for ease. One survived by folding hardship into the shape of daily bread. They rose before dawn not to conquer the stone, but to keep it from conquering them too soon. And in that quiet bargain, they found a fragile thread of purpose. When Menes could not work, Iset took his place in the quarry's lesser tasks, sorting chips, fetching water for the laborers. She moved among men whose eyes slid past her like wind over stone, for a woman's presence among the cutters was neither welcomed nor refused. It simply was, a sign that hunger had no patience for custom. Kahotep carried small loads of rubble on his narrow back, feet slipping on loose shale, lungs tight with dust. Each evening he sat by his father's side, listening to the old stories of gods who raised mountains and kings who carved them down again. In these tales, the boy found strange comfort. Perhaps it was easier to believe that their suffering held some hidden blessing, that the rocks they bled for would stand long after their names were lost. When the wind blew down the quarry's throat at dusk, it sang through the hollows in the cliffs, a low moan that Menes said was the breath of ancestors, reminding them that nothing lasted except the stone. Sometimes, when sleep eluded him, Kahotep crept from his bed to stand at the edge of the pit. He would listen to the soft hiss of sand shifting in the night, the scrape of a lizard's belly on cool rock. In those moments, he dreamed not of pyramids or statues, but of a life where he might wake without dread of stone and sun, where his mother's hands were not cracked with toil and his father's body did not carry the quarry's toll. But dawn always returned, pitiless as the stone itself. Menes healed slowly, the wound knitting with a crooked scar. He pressed his son's small shoulders, teaching him how to hold the pick, how to listen for the stone's secrets. There was a way, he said, to strike the grain just right, so that it might yield rather than fight. It was a lesson of patience, of knowing when to bend and when to break. Under that unblinking sun, boy and father stood side by side, tiny figures against the vastness of rock and time. Their shadows merged with the quarry's jagged edges, lost in the endless task of cutting dreams from earth that cared nothing for the lives spent to shape it. And so another day passed, and another, as the Nile wound its eternal path below, carrying whispers of kings and commoners alike toward the waiting sea. Far beyond the stone quarries and the sun-baked banks of the Nile, where the air grew cooler as it drifted through shaded gardens, there lay the hidden world of the scribes, a realm that seemed untouched by the chisel's bite or the scalding dust that clung to the quarryman's skin. It was said that among all the laborers of Egypt, none were more envied than the scribes, for their hands did not blister with the burden of stone or bend beneath the lash of the overseer. Yet even within this world of ink and papyrus, life carried its own quiet cruelties, etched not in granite, but in the souls of those who bore witness to every decree of the mighty. In the town of Perbastet, tucked between temple colonnades and the whispering hush of reed beds, a young scribe named Nefru sat hunched over a wooden board. His reed brush flicked and danced, trailing lines of black across the creamy surface of stretched papyrus. By the dim glow of an oil lamp, his fingers stained with soot and resin, he recorded tax rolls for a nobleman whose lands stretched farther than Nefru's weary mind could measure. He was slender and pale, a boy of 17 harvests, raised in a house where his mother once sang songs of Bastet, the gentle cat goddess who watched over hearth and kin. Now silence lay in that house like an old blanket. His mother's voice had fallen still the day the tax collector came to weigh the grain she did not have. A debt unpaid meant forfeiture, and forfeiture meant hunger. So the boy traded his youth to the scribal school, where he was taught to read the words of the gods and, more importantly, the numbers that chained men to their land. In the daytime, Nefru walked among the farmers, reed scrolls tucked beneath his arm, his bare feet brushing the stubble of freshly cut barley. He noted each sack, each bushel, each cluster of dates plucked from palm groves that trembled in the desert wind. He was a slight figure beside the overseers who carried staves and short whips, a reminder that the scribe's power was real, though it drew no blood of its own. But when dusk fell and the ledgers were closed, Nefru would retreat to his tiny chamber, perched above the storehouse where rodents scratched through spilled grain. There he unrolled scraps of stolen papyrus and wrote not of taxes or tribute, but of dreams he dared not speak aloud. He wrote of a mother's soft lullabies, of afternoons beneath fig trees where no scribe's ink ever stained his fingers. He wrote of a world where a man's worth was not counted in measures of barley or taxed by the king's decree. One night, as a hot wind blew in from the east, rattling the rush mats over his narrow window, Nefru paused over his secret scrolls. He dipped his brush, watching the ink swirl in the small clay pot. By the flicker of the flame, he imagined his words slipping beyond these walls, drifting down the streets and canals until they reached the ears of those too weary to lift their heads. Outside, a voice called his name, a low hiss that trembled at the shutter. It was Casa, another apprentice scribe, older and more cautious, his hair already thinning though his years were few. Casa slipped inside, shutting the rush mat behind him, eyes darting to the hidden scrolls. "You are reckless," he whispered. "If the overseer finds these..." Nefru pressed his finger to his lips. He knew well enough what his small rebellion could cost him. A scribe's life was privileged, but that privilege was thin as the papyrus he wrote upon. To question the measure of a tax, the weight of a king's word, such things could see his tongue torn out, his hands broken so they could wield no more ink. Yet the thought of silence was worse than the fear of punishment. These words were all that remained of his mother's lullabies, her belief that a gentler life might grow from the mud and reeds of the Nile's banks. To surrender them was to bury her voice alongside the taxes he recorded so dutifully. Casa watched him, breath shallow in the lamp's glow. "If you wish to survive, you must learn to hold your tongue and your brush alike," he urged. "Words are weightier than stone, brother. They can build a tomb just as well." Nefru looked past his friend, out the narrow slit of window where the wind carried scents of roasting fish and damp earth. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, he could hear the low murmur of farmers gathered at the tavern, trading curses for laughter, finding warmth in the cheap beer that numbed their worries for a while. He envied them, their rough hands, their cracked feet. They could speak their grievances aloud, mutter to the river or the wind. But a scribe's voice was forever divided. The words he wrote for others, and the words he dared not let slip beyond a locked door. As the night deepened, Casa drifted to sleep curled by the door, guarding the secret scrolls with his own fragile loyalty. Nefru dipped his brush once more, the black ink glistening like a promise. In his quiet rebellion, he etched verses to no god, no king, only to the pulse of life that refused to be measured by bushels and taxes. Outside, the Nile whispered on, carrying barges heavy with grain toward distant cities where priests and nobles dined in marble courts, oblivious to the ledgers that fed them. In the hush of his chamber, Nefru's heart beat steady and soft, a drum in the darkness. He wrote until the lamp guttered low, dreaming that one day his words might slip free, like the river, like the wind, untamed, uncounted, and unbound by any king's decree. Along the river's winding course, where papyrus grew thick and the water birds nested in the reeds, there drifted yet another story, one carried on the shoulders of men whose lives clung to the fickle promise of the annual flood. Here, in the hush of dawn before the labor of fields began, the farmers of Kemet stood barefoot in the dark mud, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun would soon break free. Among these quiet figures was Hori, a man neither young nor old, whose back curved like a bow from years bent over the wet earth. His hands were knotted and raw, fingers stiff from gripping the handle of his hoe until the calluses seemed part of his very flesh. Each season he stood knee-deep in the Nile's silt, his life braided tightly with the river's moods. If the floodwaters rose kindly, he and his kin would eat. If the river shrank away in anger, the grain bins would stand hollow, and hunger would gnaw at the door. This year, the river had arrived late, trickling into the fields like a half-hearted promise. Hori squatted at the edge of the canal he and his sons had dug with aching arms, willing the water to come. He ran a handful of mud through his fingers, testing its weight. Not enough, he thought. Not yet. He lifted his eyes to the pale sky, where ibis wheeled in lazy spirals, and whispered to Hapi, the river god, pleading for mercy one more time. Back at his home, a rough dwelling of reeds and clay perched above the flood line, his wife Meru stirred a thin pot of lentils over a small hearth. Their youngest child, a daughter named Citra, sat cross-legged at her mother's side, weaving together rushes for a mat they might sell at market. Citra's small fingers worked quickly, but her eyes strayed to the doorway, searching for her father's return. She did not yet understand how deeply their lives were tethered to the river's whims, only that when the water was slow to come, her mother's voice grew softer, Her father's steps grew heavier. At dusk, Hori's eldest son, Passer, returned from the overseer's yard carrying a rough tally stick. A share of the grain owed, another deducted for the noble's storehouse, a handful set aside for the temple priests. By the time the family's portion was counted, there would be little left but dreams to sow the next season. Hori sat by the threshold, pulling a clay jug to his lips and drinking the warm, brackish water as if it might fill the hollow his worry had carved inside him. Passer squatted beside him, eyes downcast. He was nearly a man now, broad-shouldered, with arms strong enough to break the dry earth when the plow could not. Yet behind that sturdy shape lingered a boy's helplessness, for even the strongest arms could not command the river to rise. That night, when the darkness swallowed the fields and the cicadas sang in the marshes, Hori lay wakeful beside his wife. He listened to her breathing and the soft rustle of citra turning in her sleep. He remembered the stories his own father had told him, of seasons when the Nile swelled so high that it kissed the edge of the desert, when children splashed in shallows teeming with fish and the air smelled of wet green life. He wondered if those days had ever truly existed, or if they were just tales conjured to make hardship bearable. Outside, the water lapped at the canal's edge, teasing the banks but refusing to flood the far rows of barley and emmer. Hori rose quietly and stepped into the night, the chill of wet mud squeezing between his toes. He walked the dikes he and his neighbors had raised by hand, their walls of packed clay snaking through the fields like scars. He stopped where the canal met the main channel, squinting at the water's slow shimmer under the thin crescent moon. He spoke to the darkness, his words drifting out like mist. Promises of offerings, prayers of gratitude, pleas wrapped in the simple language of a farmer whose wealth was measured not in gold, but in the thickness of the silt and the reach of the flood. He promised to tend the fields with care, to keep the dikes strong, to teach his sons the secrets of the furrows, as his father had taught him. For a moment, standing there alone between earth and sky, he felt small yet strangely mighty, bound to the same current that had carried pharaohs and fishermen alike for centuries. The river did not care for kings any more than it cared for peasants. It rose when it wished, fell when it must, indifferent to the weight of human need. Yet still, they prayed. Still, they bent their backs to the task. At dawn, when the first ibis cried above the reeds, Hori waded once more into the shallows. He scooped up a handful of water and let it spill through his fingers, watching the ripples glide away. Behind him, Passer and Citra came running barefoot, their feet slapping the mud, laughter clinging to them like the mist. For that single heartbeat, the world felt softer. He drew them close, pressing his cracked lips to their hair, and whispered a promise he would make again and again until the end of his days, that somehow they would endure. By the river's grace, by their own stubborn hands, by the thin thread of hope that wove their lives together, season after season, flood after flood. Far downriver, where the Nile stretched its fingers into a sprawl of marshes and hidden pools, the final threads of this great tapestry wove themselves quietly into the dusk. Here in the hush between water and sky, the villagers of a tiny hamlet called Per Nefer clung to their lives much as their ancestors had done for countless generations, by bending to the will of river and ruler alike. Among these villagers was an old woman named Tia, whose eyes had grown milky, but whose mind remained sharp as the crescent blade she once used to cut reeds along the banks. Tia's small hut perched at the edge of a papyrus thicket, its walls woven of reeds and daubed with mud, its roof patched each season with fresh thatch. She lived alone now, save for the company of a thin cat that prowled the shadows for mice, bold enough to sneak the precious grain she kept hidden in clay jars. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the date palms, Tia would light a small oil lamp and sit upon her woven mat, humming old songs to the gathering dark. Her neighbors called her a keeper of tales, one who remembered what others had forgotten or never dared to know. Children slipped through her doorway to sit at her feet, eager for stories of the gods' quarrels, of kings who rose and fell like the Nile's waters, of monsters that lurked in the deepest marshes, waiting for those who strayed too far. But Tia's true gift was not merely in telling the tales. It was in weaving them with the harsh truths that hid beneath their golden thread. For she had lived long enough to know that life in Kemet was not only measured by the glory of pyramids or the majesty of temples, but by the unrecorded sacrifices of those whose names would never be carved in stone. On a night when the wind stirred the reeds with a restless sigh, Tia gathered the children closer and spoke of what it meant to live and toil and fade beneath the great sun of Egypt. She told them of Menes the stonecutter, whose blood fed the tombs of kings, of Iset and little Kahotep, whose dreams were etched in the scars on a quarry wall, of Nephru the scribe, who dipped his brush in ink to trap truths no pharaoh could cage forever, of Hori and his kin, whose hopes rose and fell with each whisper of the river's flood. As she spoke, her voice softened into the night, drifting beyond the flicker of her lamp. She told them that for all the splendor of Egypt, its gilded coffins, its towering columns, its endless procession of gods, there was another truth that bound them all together: the quiet resilience of those who bent their backs and hushed their fears, who bartered their sweat for a mouthful of grain, who passed their stories down like a secret inheritance that even the river could not wash away. The children listened, eyelids heavy, breath slow, and even as sleep pressed upon their small bodies. Tia watched them drift into dreams, their faces soft in the warm glow of her lamp. She wondered what they would carry forward, whether they would remember the lesson hidden within the stories, that life was brutal not because the gods willed it so, but because men and kings shaped it to their desire. Yet even so, life endured, seated in the muddy banks of the Nile, fed by the same sun that burned so mercilessly overhead. When the last child slipped into sleep, curled against the reeds at her feet, Tia rose and stepped into the night. She stood at the edge of the marsh, feeling the breath of the river against her face. The water shimmered beneath the starlight, endless and patient. Somewhere far beyond the darkness, the palaces of pharaohs rose in cold majesty, guarded by stone lions and granite gates. But here at the fringe where papyrus brushed her ankles, the world belonged to the quiet ones, to the cutters and scribes and farmers and dreamers who asked for little more than a good flood, a warm fire, a tale to hold the darkness at bay. She whispered a prayer, not to the high gods in their distant shrines, but to the restless spirits of all who came before her. For those whose names were lost, but whose sweat watered the fields. For the hands that carved statues, but were never carved in turn. For the voices that rose like reeds in the wind, bending but never breaking. She thanked them for the lesson they had left behind, that in the shadow of greatness, it was the unseen many who bore the true weight of Egypt's stone heart. Then Tia turned back to her hut, the cat winding about her ankles, the lamp's faint glow waiting to welcome her return. And the Nile flowed on, carrying away her whispered words, threading them through the marshes and past the fields and temples, bearing them down to the sea, where perhaps they would find new ears to listen and remember, long after the monuments crumbled and the desert claimed what remained of kings and kingdoms alike.